The last day of death row, inmate Nicholas Lee Ingram. Execution that sparked global outrage. Hi, everyone. What happens when a nation demands justice, but the world pleads for mercy? On April 7, 1995, Nicholas Lee Ingram was executed in Georgia's electric chair, closing a chapter on one of the most controversial death penalty cases in modern history. His crime was undeniably brutal: an elderly man killed, his wife left for dead, but the story doesn't end there. Ingram was a dual British-American citizen, and as his execution date drew closer, protests erupted from across the Atlantic. Politicians, human rights groups, and religious leaders begged for clemency, claiming he had been heavily medicated during trial and unfairly portrayed as remorseless. But Georgia wouldn't budge, and in his final moments, Ingram faced death with chilling calm and one defiant request: a last cigarette. Tonight, we take you inside the final 24 hours of Nicholas Lee Ingram, a journey through desperation, silence, and a justice system pushed to its moral brink. Dear friends, as the sun rose on April 7, 1995, the air around Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Prison felt unnaturally still. Inside, Nicholas Lee Ingram lay awake in his death row cell, knowing that every passing minute brought him closer to the electric chair. For 12 years, he had fought the sentence imposed on him for the murder of J.C. Sawyer. But now, his final appeals had failed, and there would be no more delays. The world outside buzzed with controversy and protest, but inside those concrete walls, time had run out. Born in England in 1963, Ingram had moved to the United States as a child and struggled to find his footing in either culture. His adolescence was turbulent, marked by petty crime and disconnection. But nothing in his past foreshadowed the level of violence that would unfold on June 3, 1983. That evening, Ingram arrived at the quiet home of J.C. and Mary Sawyer in Cobb County, Georgia. He claimed he only wanted to use the phone, but within minutes, he pulled a .38 caliber revolver and forced the elderly couple into their truck at gunpoint. What followed was a harrowing ordeal. He bound their hands, gagged them, and led them into the woods. There, without warning, he shot both of them in the head. J.C. Sawyer died instantly. Miraculously, Mary survived and played a pivotal role in identifying her attacker. Ingram fled across several states, eventually ending up in Nebraska, where he was arrested. Despite claiming that he was too drunk to remember the crime, the evidence in Mary Sawyer's testimony led to a swift conviction for murder, kidnapping, and armed robbery. The sentence: death by electric chair. But this was only the beginning of the legal and moral storm that would surround his case. As Ingram sat on death row, new lawyers uncovered disturbing details. They claimed he had been heavily medicated during his 1983 trial, appearing emotionless and unrepentant to the jury. That flat demeanor may have been interpreted as coldness rather than the fog of antipsychotic drugs. His defense attorneys argued he had been too sedated to participate in his own defense, and that the jury had not been informed of his psychiatric diagnosis. But courts repeatedly rejected these appeals, ruling that the issues had already been addressed. Then came the international backlash. Ingram's British citizenship triggered a firestorm in the UK. His mother, Anne, launched a relentless campaign to save his life, traveling across Europe and the US, gathering support from religious leaders, politicians, and human rights groups. 53 members of British Parliament signed a letter urging clemency. The Archbishop of Canterbury and the European Parliament voiced their concern. Even British Prime Minister John Major received a personal letter from Anne Ingram, and while he responded with compassion, he ultimately refused to intervene. Back in Georgia, the state stood firm. Governor Zell Miller denied every request for clemency. Legal appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court failed, and by the afternoon of April 7, 1995, Ingram's fate was sealed. That morning, Nicholas Ingram rose quietly. Breakfast was brought to his cell: toast, eggs, perhaps some fruit, but he barely touched it. The weight of the day ahead robbed him of appetite. As the prison's sterile routines continued around him, he remained calm, even withdrawn. He had no visitors that morning, only the company of silence. He declined spiritual counseling. He didn't request a Bible. He didn't write a final statement. His world had narrowed to a quiet cell, flickering fluorescent lights, and a ticking clock. Later that day, he met with his parents for the final time. His mother had fought for him until the very end. Now, she sat across from him, separated by glass. her son's head hidden beneath a baseball cap, already shaved in preparation for the electric chair. Their conversation was short and emotional. She would later describe him as clear-headed, even peaceful. But when it came time to say goodbye, she broke down. Nicholas, however, remained composed, watching her go with quiet eyes. It would be their last meeting. As evening approached, he refused his last meal. "You're about to kill me," he said. "I don't want a last meal." He did request a cigarette, just one last cigarette. At first, prison officials denied the request, citing health regulations. The irony wasn't lost on his lawyer, Clive Stafford Smith, who publicly mocked the decision. "You're about to kill him, but you won't give him a cigarette." The backlash from media and human rights observers was swift, and the prison reversed course. Ingram was granted the cigarette, which he smoked in solitude. At 9:00 p.m., the final walk began. Ingram declined assistance and walked on his own. Dressed in white, surrounded by prison staff, he entered the execution chamber with a steady, emotionless stride. The electric chair, known as Old Sparky, sat waiting. He looked at the witnesses with a cold stare. When asked if he wanted a prayer, some say he simply replied, "Let's get on with it." Others claimed he said nothing at all. Guards secured his limbs with leather straps. Electrodes were fastened to his shaved head and leg. A leather mask was pulled over his face. Witnesses watched in hushed silence as the executioner flipped the switch. 2,000 volts surged into his body. His back arched violently. Then, more voltage, 1,000 volts. Then 208. The jolts continued in succession. Finally, at 9:15 p.m., Nicholas Lee Ingram was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, candlelight vigils burned. Some protesters prayed. Others stood in silence. Even those who supported the execution said little as the news broke. Inside, the process had played out like a rehearsed performance, cold, clinical, final. His attorney later said he wasn't good at speaking, but he wanted people to know it wasn't him who was suffering. It was his family and the victims' families. There was no public service. His ashes were not buried in Georgia. But the debate he sparked has never fully ended. Nicholas Lee Ingram's case continues to haunt discussions about capital punishment, mental health, and international justice. Some saw him as a monster. Others saw a troubled soul failed by systems on both sides of the ocean. But one truth remains. In his final 24 hours, the world was watching. And still, the question lingers, did the system get it right? Or did it extinguish a life that might have deserved another chance? In the final analysis, Nicholas Lee Ingram's story is more than the tale of a brutal crime and a courtroom sentence. It is a mirror reflecting the complexities of justice, identity, and humanity. He died unflinching, silent, and alone. His final request, a cigarette, ironically debated more than the ethics of his execution. The lines between guilt, remorse, and redemption blurred as governments argued and protesters gathered. His British roots turned his death into an international incident. Yet his life ended quietly in a Georgia prison, with no ceremony and no grave to mourn at. Whether seen as a remorseless killer or a man failed by the system, Ingram's death forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. Can a person condemned by their past ever be more than their worst moment? And what does it say about us when we choose to end a life, not in the heat of passion, but through a cold clinical process called justice?